again. I was in Colombia on one of the trips that you have helped me make, and the students were late, and so I said, "Ándale, ándale, pronto," and one of them said, "That's Mexican." And I said, "Well, what's Spanish?" "Rápido, rápido." In this hour, we want to deal with something more philosophical than the last two have been, and that is on the issue of the freedom of the will. Perry Miller was the first general editor of the Yale University Press edition of the works of Jonathan Edwards. That project began in 1957. His intent was to have all of Edwards' works in print by 2003, the 300-year anniversary of his birth. That has not happened, and the bulk of Edwards' works remains unpublished. They've done 27 volumes so far, and that is half. If that gives you any idea of how prodigious the man was. In his editor's introduction to the 1957 edition of The Freedom of the Will, Perry Miller wrote, quote, "This book alone is sufficient to establish its author as the greatest philosopher-theologian yet to grace the American scene." Miller was a fan of Edwards' mind, but not a fan of his theology or a fan of his God. Earlier, Perry Miller wrote that Edwards was popularly known, quote, "only as one who preached a distasteful and happily outmoded brand of hellfire and brimstone." The things that Edwards is probably most known for, other than that one sermon, are his book on the freedom of the will and his treatise on religious affections. Edwards had a friend in Scotland named Thomas Erskine, and he wrote about the outline for his next major work. "I have thought of writing something particularly and largely on the Arminian controversy in distinct discourses on the various points in dispute, beginning first with a discourse concerning the freedom of the will and moral agency." Now, one thing you'll notice about Puritan books, the title is usually longer than a modern book. So the freedom of the will is not the title. The original title is, see if I have it here anywhere, it is an inquiry into that modern prevailing notion of the freedom of the will that is largely held by the Arminians, the Socinians, the Arians, and he named about 4 or 5 other groups. That was simply the title. It's just that freedom of the will is all that will fit on the spine. This was, he wrote that in the summer of 1747, but several things happened that delayed the project. First, in 1748, David Brainerd died at the Edwards home, and that prompted him to publish The Life of David Brainerd, which was released in 1749. Next came the controversy within Edwards' own congregation over who was qualified to take communion, which led to him to write on that matter, which led the church to dismiss him in 1750. In a letter to Erskine just days after he preached his farewell sermon, which was interesting because he made no mention at all of him being fired. He just preached on the next verse. He wrote that his dismissal had to do with the fervor raised by his cousin, Joseph Hawley, another grandson of Solomon Stoddard, quote, falling into some essential things with Arminianism and being very bold and open in it. He was afraid that the congregation he had pastored for so many years would likely accept other doctrines. But he felt that the advancement made by the Arminians was of much greater potential for destroying religion than the views on church membership and baptism, which his grandfather Stoddard had propagated and which Edwards' opposition had led to his firing. Edwards' grandson, Timothy Dwight, who you may know for writing this hymn, "I Love Thy Kingdom, Lord." He was the author of that hymn. He estimates the actual amount of time spent writing The Freedom of the Will took only 4.5 months. But Edwards had been formulating his ideas since 1748. Oh, here is the full title. an inquiry into the modern prevailing notions of that freedom of the will, which is supposed to be essential to moral agency, virtue and vice, reward and punishment, publish and blame. His text was Romans 9:16. It is not of him that willeth. Now it's interesting. Is there a copy of that book in the church library? Freedom of the Will? I think it's around 400 pages long in an 8.5 by 11, 8.5 by 11 form. Edwards wrote it as an evangelistic tract. A 400-page evangelistic tract. Try to fit that in your shirt pocket. There were three authors that Edwards takes upon himself to refute in this great work: Thomas Chubb, Daniel Whitby, and Isaac Watts. These were three people with differing theologies. Chubb was a deist. A deist is someone who believes there's a God, but he set things in motion and then he left us on our own. Edwards believed that deism was where Arminianism was headed if an opening was given to it. Daniel Whitby was a minister in the Church of England and an Arminian. Watts was a Calvinist, a dissenting minister and theologian, and largely in agreement with Edwards on most of his theology. So by refuting these three men, he drew a broad stroke against all theologies and didn't just single out one. I want to go over each of these three men with you. Thomas Chubb had first written defending Arianism, which elevated God and noted that Christ was inferior. You know what the modern day version of Arianism is? Jehovah's Witnesses. That God is God and Christ is not God. One of the great controversies in the PCUSA was over the Mansfield-Caseman case, in which a man by that name came up for ordination, and he was asked during his ordination exam, "Is Christ God?" And his answer was, "No, God is God," and he was ordained anyway. So Chubb took up writing on the issue of a free will in his published tracts, which is what Edwards read and decided to refute. For Edwards, the Arminian understanding of free will was the crucial point of theology, and it destroyed biblical Christianity. While many of his colleagues thought that a bad understanding of the effects of original sin had led to a bad understanding of the will, Edwards thought just the opposite. For this reason, he wrote The Freedom of the Will before he wrote the great doctrine of the Christian doctrine of original sin defended. Here is how Edwards saw the problem. It is precisely by taking refuge in the autonomy of their wills that people avoid full-scale confession of sin. Because the Arminian view was that things did not have a pre-existing cause, and that the sinful nature was not an inclination to sin. Therefore, they didn't really choose the sin, and therefore nothing was there to confess. It just happened. But if each act requires a conscious choice before the act can occur, it enhances the sin. Well, your sin is worse. You chose it. You've heard people say things like this: well, he fell into sin. Nobody fell into sin. They walked into it. They chose it. The opposite view diminishes greatly personal responsibility. And as Edwards explained it, Arminians would hide behind their supposed inability, and they use it as an excuse. I couldn't help it. Now today, pop psychology has embraced a lot of that by saying, well, it's not really a sin, it's a sickness. He's got a disease. He's got a disease of alcoholism. He's got a disease of sexual addiction. So he's not really responsible. You're not mad at people with the flu throwing up. That's what people with the flu do, but it's a disease. Edwards actually has a sermon that I've published, and I couldn't tell you which book it's in, but it is addiction to sin is no excuse for it. It's rather an aggravation of it. And here's his reasoning. Before you can be addicted to something, you've got to do it so many times that you can't not do it anymore. He said, how is continual sinning any excuse for continual sinning? There's that logic again. Since it's impossible for me to do what God commands, they would say, he can't really expect me not to do it. And therefore my sin is not as great because I can't help myself. Edwards pointed out that not only could they help themselves, they weren't even doing what they were actually capable of doing. Find another place to buy gas. Find another place to buy milk. And so they were justifying what they did by their supposed inability to do otherwise. That was Thomas Chubb. Daniel Whitby was a Church of England theologian who first came to public attention because of his strong tracts against Romanist theology. He was most well known for his paraphrase and commentary on the New Testament, published in 1703, the year Edwards was born. He was a strong anti-Calvinist. He later gave evidence of strong Arian and Unitarian tendencies. In 1710, he wrote a discourse on the 5 points of Calvinism. What Edwards interacted with most was the fourth discourse on the liberty of the will of man in a state of trial and probation. So Whitby said this, it is better to deny foreknowledge than liberty. He said it is better to say that God doesn't know the future or that God both does and doesn't know the future. How do you come up with stuff like that? In fact, today, this goes under the heading, the openness of God theology. God can't know the future because it hasn't happened yet, they say. Edwards argued that if God knows the future with certainty, which he argued on the basis of God's eternal decrees, then the future is predestined and determined, even though men make the choices they want to. Whitby also strenuously denied the imputation of Adam's sin to the rest of mankind. In doing so, he showed himself to be more of a Pelagian than an Arminian. Now, let me just take a minute to explain some terms. Pelagius was a 4th century British monk who argued that Adam's sin affected Adam only. It did not go down the line to you, me, and all of Adam's posterity. He said that man was born neutral, without original sin, and that he can choose this or he can choose that, either side of the issue. Whitby said, it is not just for God to condemn us for not doing that which is impossible for us to do. In other words, since it's impossible for you to be perfect, God can't expect you to do it. The only problem with that, God says to do it. So he must expect you to do it. Or, here's the gospel, find somebody who can for you. Then there's Isaac Watts. Edwards held him in high regard, but was responding to the Arminian views of the freedom of the will held by this normally orthodox English minister. Now, Watts was well known in New England. He was a literary agent for Benjamin Coleman, who was a close friend of Edwards. He sent books to the Harvard and Yale libraries. He collected money for missionary works among the Indians. He found donors for Harvard, helped to pick textbooks and professors for that school, counseled many of New England's governors, and wrote catechisms and hymns and other texts that were used in New England churches and schools. And he wrote a strong endorsement for Edwards' faithful narrative of the surprising work of God, which Benjamin Coleman had sent him. If you do family devotions, one of the books that you should get your hands on is the Psalms and Hymns of Isaac Watts. It's a hardbound book. He wrote over 700 hymns by paraphrasing the Psalms. Watts wrote a work entitled An Essay on the Freedom of the Will in God and in Creatures. In that work, Watts asserts that because the soul is of an active nature, it comes to pass spontaneously of themselves without a cause. In other words, there's no reason why you do anything, you just do it. His major point in the work is that there are things perfectly indifferent in the mind's view concerning which the will determines without reference to a prevailing motive or greater good. With that in mind, we turn to Edwards in asserting that man freely chooses whatever seems good to him. This is Edwards on the freedom of the will. There are three phrases that we use in discussing this: free will, freely willing, and free willing. That's a movie about a whale. It has nothing to do with anything we're talking about here. Edwards says the will is free in that it is your will, and you freely exercise it. You do exactly what you want to do. You do what seems good to you. You choose what seems good to you to choose. If you could find something better to choose, you would choose that. So you're here because this is the best choice that was available to you. My first job after I left home, after I graduated from high school, was at a McDonald's in Monrovia, California, which was a largely Hispanic black area. At the time, McDonald's had a very short menu. If you want to have a few good laughs on YouTube, look up the comedian Sinbad talking about McDonald's. I heard this, I was in tears, I was laughing so hard. But the time I worked at McDonald's, the menu was hamburgers, cheeseburgers, double hamburgers, double cheeseburgers, fries, drinks, shakes, and brownies. Our guy had brownies. The menu's right up there on the screen. People would come in, look at this. I'll have 2 chili dogs, 3 tacos, onion rings. Well, they freely ordered it. It's not on the menu. You can freely order what is ever on the menu to you as a sinner. You can't freely order anything if it's not on the menu. Interestingly enough, the owner of that particular McDonald's franchise was Jewish, not by religion, but by birth, ethnicity. And he said, I'll tell you what, if that many people want fish sandwiches, we're going to give them fish sandwiches. Our McDonald's started the fish burger. So he had us go down to the local Lucky or Vaughn's supermarket and buy 20 pounds of fish patties, and we started selling fish patties because so many people wanted them. That's beside the point. You always choose what seems good to you. No one forces your will, or it couldn't be your will. Jack Benny is an older comedian. He used to have a routine where he was standing in Central Park and a man came up to him and put a gun to his head and said, "Your money or your life?" And Benny just stood there. And the guy said, "I said your money or your life?" And Benny said, "I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about it." Well, God doesn't put a gun to anybody's head. He doesn't force the will. What does he do? He changes the will. You still choose what seems good to you. But what seemed good to you before is not the same as what seems good to you now. When you were an unregenerate person with a heart that was as black as that carnation, you freely chose whatever seemed good to you. You chose vice because you loved it, and you did not choose virtue because you did not love it. And then God comes in with what Edwards calls, and forgive the expression, the holy rape of the soul. He changes your heart, and you still do what seems good to you, but what seems good to you now was not what seemed good to you before. But it's still your choice. Flip Wilson made a lot of money with this act, "The Devil Made Me Do It." The devil didn't make you do it, and God didn't make you do it. You chose to do it because you wanted to. It is indeed as repugnant to reason to suppose that an act of the will should come into existence without a cause, as to suppose the human soul, or an angel, or the globe of the earth, or the whole universe should come into existence without a cause. Now, Edwards spends a great deal of time in his freedom of the will simply defining his terms. That's a good reminder for all of us to do. Make sure that what they're saying, you understand what they mean by what they're saying. Dr. Gerstner was giving a lecture one time at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And a student stood up and said, "Dr. Gerstner, may I assume that you're a Calvinist?" And Gerstner said, yes, you can assume that. And the man sat down, and about 2 minutes later, he says, "Wait a minute, what do you mean by Calvinist?" The young man said, "Well, you can do whatever you want, it doesn't make any difference. If that's a Calvinist, I'm no Calvinist. Fortunately, that's not a Calvinist." And so always make sure that when somebody says, "Do you believe such and such?" What do you mean by that? What is it you're asking me if I believe? Because you may agree to something and you think, "Wait, I don't believe that for a minute." To have a truly free will, Edwards says, we must be free from hindrance or impediment in the way of doing. In other words, if anyone has an inclination or a disposition towards one side or another of an issue, the will isn't free. Now, when Jesus talked about this, he said, "He who sins is the" what? Slave of sin. Isn't that term antithetical to any discussion of freedom? And he said this about men and their inclination. How do men feel about the darkness? They love it. Men love the darkness, so they're not indifferent. Their will isn't free in that sense. They're not neutral. They will always do sinful things because they love to sin. And they hate God. That's a pre-existing condition. Before these sessions today, my brother Dave and I went to the drive-in hamburger stand down in Henderson, and we had hot dogs. You say, "Well, you freely had hot dogs." Well, yes and no. They also had a broccoli burger. No, that ain't going to happen. Why not? Because I hate broccoli. I'm not indifferent toward broccoli. There isn't enough Velveeta in the world to put on broccoli to make me eat broccoli. So it really isn't a free choice. Plus, we had a limited amount of time. We didn't have time to go to Applebee's and wait 40 minutes to get bread. We didn't have money to go someplace and get a steak. So there were conditions that factored into our decision. Let's face it, if you were really neutral, you go to a restaurant, "Ladies, can I take your order?" "No." "What do you want from the menu?" "I don't know." "Well, do you like chicken?" "I don't know." "Do you like vegetables?" "I don't know." If you're indifferent to anything, there will be nothing that makes you choose. You're having a barbecue out back, you're out of mustard. Wife says, "Can you run down to Winco and get us some mustard?" 2 hours later, you come back. "Do you have the mustard?" "No, I couldn't decide." Couldn't decide what? Couldn't decide which brand of mustard to get. "Well, how many are there?" "Well, there's French's, there's Goulden. Why didn't you just get one?" "Well, I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings." You don't know this, but when we were young and not as rich as we are today, we used to go to school with mustard sandwiches. Piece of Wonder white bread, some mustard slapped on it, fold over, put in a baggie. That was all. That's lunch. And the other kids would be having these meat sandwiches 4 inches high with bags of potato chips, Frito-Lay, nickel bags, not a few thrown into some wax paper and crushed. They had metal lunch boxes, Lone Ranger lunchbox. We had a paper bag we had to use for a week. So anyway, after seeing all these and they had Twinkies wrapped. We got a slice of chocolate cake wrapped in wax paper. So I remember coming home and saying, "These other kids get meat on their sandwiches. We get mustard." And Mom said, "Well, they don't understand what you're getting is a French delicacy." A what? Yes. You notice the name on the jar? French's. That line worked for 15 years. That's how dumb we kids were. You say, "I can't decide what brand of mustard. I'm indifferent." You're not indifferent to anything. You come with pre-existing conditions. The soul cannot choose without choice or prefer prefer without preference. The mind is not indifferent when it determines itself, but would rather do one thing than another, and would rather determine itself one way than another. Here's a lengthy quote from Edwards, which states the position of the Arminians, Pelagians, and Deists as succinctly as he can, and then his refutation of it. The Arminian notion of liberty is that there is a sovereignty in the will, and that the will determines itself, so that its determination to choose or refuse this or that is primarily within itself, which description of liberty implies a self-contradiction. For it supposes the will in its first act of choosing or refusing to be determined by itself implies that there is an antecedent act of the will before the first act, which is a contradiction. There can be no fallacy in this, for we know that if the will determines its own act, it does not determine it without acting. Here's the contradiction. There's an act of the will before the first act. Now, I think that's hilarious. That you had to exist before you existed to choose what you chose, even though you weren't allowed to choose. And yet there are philosophy professors that get paid to talk like that. There is an act of the will determining what it shall choose before the first act of choice, which is much to say that there's an act of volition before the first act of volition. For the will's determining what it will choose is choosing. The will must choose before it chooses in order to determine what it will choose. This strikes me as hilarious. But I guess when you read this kind of stuff, something in there's got to be funny. And so going backward into infinity, the Arminian himself runs himself out of his assertion. Edwards' point is simply that if the will chooses its choice, it must be supposed to choose the choice. And before that, it would have to decide to choose this choice, and on and on. Why does the will choose what it chooses if there's no basis for the choice? That's Edwards' question. On what basis did you choose? Again, we're talking about clothing. Why did you wear a red dress? Because my husband told me I look good in red. Okay, that's the reason. Why did you wear those pants? They're the only ones I've got I can button. Makes sense. So Edwards makes the distinction between the freedom to choose and freedom of choice. You see the difference? You freely choose what seems good to you. You do exactly what you want to do. You do exactly what you're inclined to do. You will always act according to your strongest inclination or desire. So man is always free to do what he wills, but not to do what he does not will. Now take this into the temptations in the garden. Adam and Eve are created holy and upright. Satan comes to them with a question. Did God say you can't eat anything from that tree or touch it? They were not created with any slant one way or the other. They were free to choose good or to choose evil. Augustine said they were passa peccare, passa non peccare, able to sin, able not to sin. They chose to sin. The question nobody can answer is, how could that look good to them? How could doing what God said not to do seem good to them when they'd never disobeyed him before and they had no idea how good it felt to sin? Gerstner said that's the one question he's never been able to answer. How could sin be good to Adam and Eve? But they caved. And after that, they became passa peccare, only able to sin. Thomas Boston did a similar work called Human Nature in its Fourfold State. The Banner of Truth has published that. You can get it any time. Or not get it any time. You're free to choose. He said man goes through 4 states. He's able to sin, able not to sin. After he sins, he's only able to sin. After God changes his heart, he's able to sin, able not to sin. And after God sanctifies him perfectly in heaven, he's only able not to sin. So we have the temptation of Adam and Eve in the garden. Then we skip ahead hundreds of years to the temptation of Christ in the desert. Notice the different circumstances. One's in paradise, one's in the desert. They were both over food. I can understand the temptation there. And interestingly enough, Jesus had been out in the desert for 6 weeks without food and without any human contact. I asked a medical doctor one time if a person did not eat for 6 weeks, what would his physical state be in? He said he'd have lost half his body weight, he would be delusional, he would be depressed, and he went on to list all kinds of other things, and the Bible says, then the tempter came to him. If you think Satan's going to attack you when you're at your strongest, he may. He's not afraid to attack you at your weakest either. And he said to Jesus, command that these stones become bread. Now, if you hadn't eaten for 6 weeks, that's a pretty legitimate temptation, don't you think? But Jesus said, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. And so Satan says, oh, okay, we're going to play verse volleyball. Okay. Everybody says, Jesus held out because he quoted Scripture. So did Satan. He was quoting Scripture. He was just misquoting it. And then he takes him to the top of a mountain. And he showed him all the kingdoms of the world, the Bible says. He said, all these I will give you if you'll just cast yourself down and worship me. One of the Puritans wrote that as always what Satan wants us to do is to cast ourselves down. What was the problem with that temptation that he was offering Jesus? I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world if you'll cast yourself down and follow me. What's the matter with that temptation? They're already his. I already own all those, Satan. Have you got a temptation or not? That's what the Bible says. And all the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of his Christ. You know why Jesus didn't give in? Because there was nothing Satan could offer him that was worth giving up what he already possessed, and that was unbroken fellowship with God the Father. So how come we do give in? Because we're willing to give up unbroken fellowship with God the Father. Because we've never known what unbroken fellowship with God the Father is like. Satan couldn't offer Jesus anything that was worth giving up what he had. Now, how that got through to Adam and Eve, I don't know. But again, both of them made choices. If a sinner is born in sin, and here's where it becomes evangelistic, because this has to do with salvation. If a sinner is born in sin, he has an inherent disposition to sin. As Jesus said, men love the darkness. That's a pre-existing condition. And he said to the scribes and Pharisees, you are of your father the devil, and you want to do his will. That's a pre-existing condition of loving the will of the Father. If men love the darkness and want to do the will of their father the devil, then they have an inclination and a disposition to sin and cannot be said to be neutral or free when it comes to choosing. So it's not within a man to choose contrary to his nature. You will always choose according to your nature. If a man's nature is sinful, his choices of necessity must be sinful choices. A man cannot change his essential nature. The scripture says it this way, when a leopard can change his spots and a white man can choose to be, or a black man can choose to be a white man, then you can do what is right, O man. So if you ask, well, when is that? Well, the answer is obvious, never. A black man cannot choose to be a white man simply by an act of the will. And don't bring up Michael Jackson. He did not do that on his own. He had help, and so must the sinner. And the application of all this is the death blow to Arminian evangelism. The sinner must look outside himself for salvation and for a changed heart, to choose that which he now hates, God, and to hate what he now loves, sin. Jesus said, here's the problem. You will not come to me that you might have life, which is exactly what dead men need. Edwards saw the problem so clearly, it's a wonder that anyone has dared to argue with him about it since that time. All right, that's all I have for today. You can ask me questions. That does not necessitate that I have an answer, but you can ask the questions if you like. We have a few minutes, and then we are done. And your question will keep you from eating sooner than later, so your choice. By the way, Edwards once gave an invitation that went like this. Your choice whether you go to heaven or hell. You choose. That was the whole invitation. I think the best invitation I've ever heard was at Grace Baptist Church in Glendora, California. The dean of the college where I had attended was a man named Ron Klein. He was also an assistant pastor at this conservative Baptist church. And he left to go to Quito, Ecuador, to be the pastor to the missionary families down there, English-speaking missionary families. He was gone for 2 or 3 years and came back on sabbatical to do some fundraising. So they asked him to preach, which he was glad to do. And he gave a sermon about how Christians are consistent. And he illustrated it this way. He called for 2 volunteers to come up. He blindfolded them. He said, now, I have a Snickers bar here, and I have an onion here. Excuse me, he didn't say so. He said, I have a candy bar here, and I have an onion here. So he held the candy bar to the first man and said, take a bite. The man did. He said, now, is that an onion or a candy bar? He said, it's a candy bar. Do you know what kind of candy bar it is? Yes, it's a Snickers bar. How do you know that? You got a blindfold on. Because I've eaten a lot of Snickers bar, and that's what they taste like. So Snickers bar is consistent with other Snickers bars. Yes, it is. So he had the other man take a bite of the onion. He said, is that an onion or a candy bar? He says, it's an onion. How do you know? You're blindfolded. Because that's what onions taste like. So his point was these things are consistent. And he says, if you're a Christian, you should be consistent with what Christ says about Christians. And then he finished his sermon and he said, now the elders have asked me to give an invitation. He says, I don't really believe in those anymore. Evidently he had changed his theology some. I mean, it automatically disqualified him from being a Baptist. If you don't give an invitation, you're dead. He says, they have asked me to give an invitation, and I'm a man under authority, so I will. He said, here's the invitation. If God has spoken to you and told you you need to do something tonight, don't you dare stay in your seat. And if God has not spoken to you and told you to do something tonight, don't you dare get up. He says, we're not going to sing 61 verses as just as I am. I'm going to go sit down. You do what you need to do. Well, that was the greatest invitation I've ever heard. Freedom of the will. Anybody? Okay, people want sandwiches. You're dismissed. I'll see you tomorrow in Sunday school, 9:30. So we talk about Edwards and the happiness of God.
That sounds awesome. You know, I wish